On February 22, 1980, a village of 2,500 people in the Adirondack Mountains beat the Soviet Union at hockey and became, for 17 days, the most famous town on Earth. 17 nations, 252 athletes. The village had hosted the Winter Olympics once before, in 1932, for roughly $1.05 million, the cheapest Winter Games ever staged. Hosting them a second time in 1980 cost $169 million, and the transport plan collapsed so badly that the governor of New York declared a state of emergency at a peacetime sporting event. Today, the village counts 2,205 people, fewer than it held on the morning the world showed up. The resort that had invented the American winter vacation, the one institution that kept its doors open through the snow when every other mountain hotel in the country boarded up for the season, did not survive to see the second Olympics finish paying its bills. 5 weeks after the closing ceremony, it shut down and filed for bankruptcy. Its building sat empty through the 1980s and 1990s, burned by arsonists 8 times in 11 months, and were finally leveled by a wrecking ball on the first morning of 2002, with nobody in particular watching. The building where the athletes of 1980 had slept never closed at all. It reopened as a federal prison, and it still holds roughly 1,000 inmates a few miles from the rink where the game was won. A village hosted 2 of the biggest sporting spectacles in its country's history, 48 years apart, and lost its own economy somewhere in the gap between them. This is the story of how a mountain town built an empire out of winter and what it cost to keep hosting the world. Chapter 1. The Land Nobody Wanted. The village sits on a plateau at roughly 1,800 feet inside the Adirondack High Peaks, wedged between 2 small lakes that share almost the same name, Mirror Lake and Lake Placid itself. Whiteface Mountain rises to 4,867 feet a few miles north. New York City sits nearly 300 miles south, a full day's journey in any century before the automobile. The plateau has no navigable river. It has no harbor. It has no coal, no canal, nothing a wagon could carry downstream to a buyer. Every other American boomtown of the 19th century was built on something that could be shipped out of it: iron, lumber, grain, loaded onto a rail car, and sent toward a market that never had to see where it came from. This plateau offered nothing of the kind. Whatever fortune it made would have to come from people willing to travel toward it, not goods willing to travel away. Archibald McIntyre tried anyway. McIntyre was a Scottish-born New York State comptroller who had spent years auditing other men's ventures before deciding to fund one of his own. And in 1809 he erected ironworks in the township that would later become North Elba, betting the ore veins in the hills would justify hauling machinery into mountains with no roads worth the name. The ore was there. What was not there was any cheap way to move it. No rail line, no water route, no forge, near enough to matter. The works never grew past a modest operation, and within years, the site was abandoned and lost to anyone who did not already know where to look. The soil was thin, acidic, sitting on granite, with a growing season short enough that a late frost in June was not unusual. Families who tried to farm it fed themselves and little more. By the 1840s, the plateau around North Elba was land nobody particularly wanted, too poor for agriculture, too remote for industry, too cold for half the year to justify the trip. And then, in 1849, a wealthy reformer named Gerrit Smith decided that worthless land might still be worth something, if the point was not profit, but the vote. New York law required a man to own at least $250 in property before he could cast a ballot, a bar few black New Yorkers could clear. Smith owned roughly 120,000 acres scattered through the Adirondacks and began giving away 40-acre parcels by the thousand to free black men across the state, land that cost him little and that, on paper, cleared the property requirement instantly. A settlement of black families took root near North Elba. They called it Timbuktu. Among those drawn to the project was John Brown, an Ohio-born tanner and wool merchant who had spent 2 decades failing at a string of businesses before finding, in his 50s, the cause that would define him. In 1849, Brown bought 244 acres from Smith and moved his family up from Massachusetts to teach the Timbuktu settlers how to farm a plateau that had already defeated McIntyre's laborers. The lesson did not take, not because Brown lacked conviction, but because the plateau itself was the obstacle. The growing season was too short, the soil too thin, the winters too long for crops that worked in gentler country. Farm after farm failed. Families drifted back to the cities they had left. Timbuktu, as a settlement of working farms, did not survive the climate that had already emptied out McIntyre's iron town. Brown himself went on from North Elba to Kansas, and then to the raid at Harper's Ferry, and in 1859 he was hanged for it. His body was brought back to the farm and buried there, beside the house he had lived in for less than 2 years, before the raid pulled him away for good. Timbuktu was gone by then, in every sense but the grave was enough. People who had never had a reason to travel to a plateau with no river, no harbor, and no ore worth mining began making the trip anyway, not for land, not for timber, not for iron, but to stand at one man's headstone. A place that could not sell what it grew or mined had discovered, almost by accident, that it could sell where someone was buried. The pilgrims who came for Brown's grave were the first outsiders the plateau had ever drawn on purpose. Within 20 years, thousands more would follow them in, for reasons that had nothing to do with graves. Chapter 2. The Fools Who Came Anyway. In 1869, an ordained minister named William H. Murray published a slim guidebook called Adventures in the Wilderness, promising city clerks and shopkeepers that a train ticket and a canoe paddle were all that stood between them and the wildest country left in the eastern United States. The newspapers in Boston and New York did not believe a word of it, mocking the thousands who packed their kit and boarded the trains anyway, as dubbed Murray's fools. The mockery did not slow anyone down. That first season, so many amateur sportsmen arrived with rifles, fishing rods, and no real idea how to survive a mountain night that every farmhouse with a spare bed filled within weeks. They came for the fishing. The air mattered just as much, air that city doctors could not prescribe and city rent could not buy. Above all, a slim book had told them a wilderness existed that was meant to be looked at, not logged or plowed. The farmers who had already lost their fight with the plateau's thin soil did not leave. They changed occupations instead. Men who had fought granite and a short growing season for a decade became guides, walking strangers into the woods for a daily fee. Their wives became cooks, setting 3 meals a day for boarders in houses built for 4. Their sons became boatmen, poling customers across water their grandfathers had only ever fished for supper. Not a metaphorical reinvention, an actual one. The same hands, the same families, now selling the worthlessness that had defeated them for 60 years. Land too poor to farm and too remote to mine had become the product itself, and nobody had to plant or dig anything, only walk a visitor through it and collect payment. Demand outgrew farmhouse spare rooms fast. In 1877, developers opened the Stevens House on Signal Hill, above Mirror Lake, the highest hotel yet raised in the Adirondacks and by a wide margin, the largest building the village had ever seen. Picture Signal Hill on an August evening in 1900. Lamplight fills window after window of a hotel holding 500 guests at capacity, more people asleep under one roof than had lived in the entire township 60 years earlier. Coaches from the rail depot climbed the hill in a steady line, trunks strapped to the roof. On the veranda, men who spent their winters in Manhattan offices watched the sun go down over a lake that 80 years before had not been worth naming on a map. A plateau that once could not feed the families, farming it was now housing 500 paying strangers a night. It had already survived one disaster to get there. On Christmas Eve of 1885, a stovepipe in the kitchen wing overheated, and by morning the Stevens house was gone, burned to its foundation, while guests who had traveled up from Philadelphia and Washington stood in the snow and watched it go. The owners rebuilt through the following spring and reopened larger than before. The hotel that beat the fire of 1885 would not beat the 20th century a second time. In the late 1940s, long after its grand hotel years had faded, the Stevens house came down for good, its grounds cut into house lots. A second business arrived alongside the guides and hoteliers, built on the same air that had drawn Murray's Fools north. In 1884, a New York physician named Dr. Edward Livingston Trudeau, himself fighting the tuberculosis other doctors had given up treating, opened a small sanatorium in neighboring Saranac Lake, convinced the region's cold, dry air could arrest a disease his colleagues considered a death sentence. Within a few years, Adirondack air was marketed nationally as a cure. Patients arrived by the trainload, wealthy enough to spend a year or more in the mountains fighting for their lungs. And their families came with them, needing somewhere respectable to wait out a diagnosis that could take years to resolve either way. Wilderness had already proven it could be sold as adventure. Now it could be sold as medicine. And the two trades, guiding sportsmen and boarding invalids, operated within a few miles of each other on a plateau that, 80 years earlier, had failed to support a single family of farmers. Between the fools chasing Murray's book and the patients chasing Trudeau's air, the plateau now ran two industries built on nothing more than people choosing to show up. It would take one more arrival, a librarian with very particular ideas about who was welcome, to turn that traffic into an institution. Chapter 3: The Librarian's Rules. The man who arrived in 1895 had already spent 2 decades organizing the world's books before he ever thought to organize a mountain. Melville Dewey was a New York librarian, born in a small town in the same state, who as a young man in his 20s had devised a system for shelving library collections by subject rather than by size or acquisition date, a scheme of nested numbers that would eventually order the shelves of nearly every public library in the United States. By 1895, he was one of the most influential men in American librarianship, a founder of professional associations, a builder of institutions, a man whose entire career rested on the conviction that disorder was a problem to be solved with the correct classification. That year, he and his wife, Annie Godfrey Dewey, a Massachusetts-born graduate of Wellesley College, who managed much of the couple's business affairs, bought a farmhouse on the shore of Mirror Lake. Out of that farmhouse, the two of them founded the Lake Placid Club. The club was not a hotel, in the way the Stevens house up the hill was a hotel. It was a private membership community, admission by invitation only, built around a code Dewey had worked out with the same instinct he had once applied to call numbers. Members ate plain food, at fixed hours, prepared under Dewey's own dietary rules. Trails, courts, and golf links kept them exercising on a schedule the club itself maintained. A Protestant discipline governed the rest of their day, one that treated idleness as clutter, the same clutter Dewey had spent his professional life removing from library shelves. The club did not simply house guests. It sorted them, admitted the ones who fit the system, and asked them to live inside it for the length of their stay. The system grew the way Dewey's numbering system had grown, by relentless, incremental addition. In the decades after 1895, the club bought land whenever land came up for sale around it, parcel after parcel, until a single farmhouse on Mirror Lake had become an estate running to several thousand acres. Dairy farms went up to feed its members. A power plant followed, built to light its own buildings. Golf courses came next, laid across ground that 80 years earlier had barely grown a season's worth of oats. By the early 20th century, the club counted dozens of buildings on its own grounds, a private town inside the public one, with its own rules, its own economy, and its own gate. Every other mountain resort in the country ran on the same seasonal clock. The Stevens house filled in June and emptied by October. Hotels across the Adirondacks and the White Mountains and the Catskills boarded their windows before the first hard snow and waited for spring the way a shopkeeper waits out a slow season. Winter was not a market. Winter was the reason the market closed. Dewey did not close. In the winter of 1904 and 1905, he kept the Lake Placid Club open through the season for the first time, and instead of asking the members who stayed to simply endure the cold, he handed them equipment for it. Ice skates for the frozen lake outside the clubhouse windows, toboggans for the hills behind it, and a set of long wooden skis imported from Scandinavia, a piece of equipment almost nobody in the eastern United States had ever strapped to their own boots. What had been a season to survive became a season with its own recreations, its own schedule, its own reason for a member to book a room in January rather than August. No other American resort had tried it. The Lake Placid Club, a private institution built by a man who classified books for a living, had effectively invented the winter vacation as an American commercial product. And within a generation, every ski town from Vermont to Colorado would trace its business model back to the same idea Dewey had tested on his own membership that winter. That cold, properly organized, was not an obstacle to tourism, but a season of it. Dewey had built his club the way he built everything else, with a rule for each decision and a category for each person. Food had rules. So did exercise. Admission carried its own rule too, and that was the one that would eventually cost him the career he had spent building before he ever bought a farmhouse on Mirror Lake. Chapter 4. The Rule in Writing. The rule that would cost Dewey his career was not a rumor, not a whispered club policy denied when asked about directly. It was printed. In 1901, in the club's own literature, Dewey set down in his own words who the Lake Placid Club would never admit. No one would be received against whom there was physical, moral, social, or race objection. He did not stop at the general clause. He added a second sentence, naming the group the general clause was written to cover, stating that it had been found impractical to make exception to Jews. The same man who had spent his professional life building a system to sort books without prejudice had built a system to sort people with it, and he had put the second system into print under his own name, in a document members carried home and other resorts, in time, copied. The petition reached Albany in 1904. The New York State Board of Regents, the body that had employed Dewey for years as the state's official librarian, received a formal demand that he be removed from that post over the exclusion policy at his private mountain club. The regents did not fire him. They convened, reviewed the printed rule and the complaints against it, and issued instead a public rebuke. A formal censure entered into the record without the penalty of dismissal attached to it. It was, by the standards of 1904, an unusual outcome. Not exoneration, not punishment, a body of state officials on record disapproving of a man they declined to remove. Dewey understood the message, even though the regents had not forced his hand. He left the state library post not long after the censure, resigning from the position that had made him a public figure before he had ever bought a farmhouse on Mirror Lake. The library profession finished what Albany had started. Dewey had helped found the American Library Association. He had built its early conferences, shaped its early standards, made himself, by any fair account, one of the men the institution existed because of. None of that carried him through. By 1906, the same association that owed its founding partly to him had pushed him out of its ranks entirely, its leadership unwilling to keep extending its name to a member whose own name was now attached, publicly and in his own handwriting, to a rule about who did not belong. The rule outlived every consequence attached to it. It stayed in Lake Placid Club literature for decades after the censure, decades after Dewey's resignation, decades after his death in 1931, printed and reprinted for members who joined an institution built, in explicit language, to keep certain people out of it. Not until 2019, more than a century after Dewey wrote the sentence about Jews, did the American Library Association finally act on it in the way its founders' names were meant to be honored. It stripped Dewey's name from its highest award, the medal that had carried it since 1953, because the rule he wrote in 1901 was still, in 2019, the reason his name could no longer stand for the profession he had organized. None of it slowed the club down. By the 1920s, the institution Dewey had built on Mirror Lake was operating at a scale the plateau had never supported before it and would not support again after it. Golf courses laid across former farmland, ski jumps cut into the hillsides, groomed trails threading the grounds in every direction, orchestras playing for a membership list drawn from the American establishment. Men whose names filled the same newspapers that had once mocked Murray's fools for coming north with fishing rods. The village outside the gates lived on what the club generated and could not generate itself. Hotels booked with overflow guests, guides hired for members who wanted the mountains without the club's own staff, teamsters hauling supplies up from the rail depot, laundries washing linen by the wagon load, builders adding rooms to a private town that never stopped expanding. Lake Placid, the village, had become a national name. The brand behind that name belonged to one man's private membership organization, and by the 1920s, it had grown too large for the village itself to compete with or escape. Melville Dewey had one son. In the winter of 1928, Godfrey Dewey would come home from a mountain half a world away with an idea his father's exclusion clause had never touched, an idea about who the plateau might invite in rather than keep out. Placid Chapter 5. The Vote in Lausanne. Godfrey Dewey had grown up inside the rules his father wrote, on a club grounds that operated by schedule and category, the way a library operates by call number. And in March of 1928, he came home from Switzerland with an idea the exclusion clause had never touched. He had spent the winter at the Olympic Winter Games in St. Moritz, watching bobsled crews and speed skaters and ski jumpers compete on terrain that, to a man who had grown up on Mirror Lake, looked a great deal like the terrain outside his own windows. On March 21, 1928, he brought the idea home and pitched it to the local Kiwanis Club, that a village of a few thousand people in the Adirondack High Peaks could host the Winter Olympics itself. The Kiwanis men had spent their lives watching the Lake Placid Club expand around them, without ever asking the village's permission. Godfrey Dewey was asking them to expand something in the other direction, outward, toward the rest of the world. The bid moved through the machinery bids, moved through letters and delegations, and a formal application to the International Olympic Committee. And on April 10, 1929, the committee convened a session in Lausanne and awarded the 1932 Winter Games to Lake Placid, New York. The vote made a village smaller than a single Manhattan block, the host of a global event for the second time in the century, after John Brown's grave and Melville Dewey's clubhouse had already turned it into a place strangers traveled to see. The village had no bobsled run. The village had no stadium built to hold a crowd larger than the ones that came for club golf tournaments. The village had one small ski jump, the same hill the Lake Placid Club's own members had been using for 2 decades of private recreation. Lausanne had awarded the games to a plateau that, on the day of the vote, could not have staged a single Olympic event on the books. What the village did have was Albany, and the governor's office there was occupied, as of January 1929, by Franklin Roosevelt, a Hyde Park aristocrat 3 years from the presidency, who had spent his first year in the State House, Learning what New York's rural counties needed and could not fund themselves, Roosevelt signed the bill authorizing the state to build a bobsled run on private land, a legal question nobody had needed to answer before, and the legislature approved $100,000 to $25,000 to build it. Godfrey Dewey supplied the land himself, a parcel of his family's holdings on Mount Van Hoevenberg, cut over to the state for what became the first bobsled run in North America. The money came together in the years the country could least afford it, 1929 sliding into 1930, and 1930 into the deepening of the Depression, and what the town of Lake Placid could not carry on its own tax base, the state carried, and what the state would not carry alone, the club and its members carried beside it. In February of 1932, the Olympic Winter Games opened in Lake Placid, the first Winter Games ever staged on American soil. 17 nations sent athletes. 252 competitors raced and jumped and skated across venues that 4 years earlier had not existed. The total cost ran to roughly $1.05 million, most of it spent on the new bobsled run at Mount Van Hoevenberg, and the stadium built to seat the crowds Lausanne's vote had promised would come. Against the scale of what later Olympics would cost, the figure would look almost quaint. Against what a village that size had ever spent on anything, it was the largest sum Lake Placid had ever put into the ground at once. When the closing ceremony ended, the village had exactly what Godfrey Dewey had pitched to the Kiwanis Club 4 years earlier, a permanent place on the map of world sport, its name now filed beside St. Moritz and Chamonix in the record books of an event that came around once every 4 years and never stayed longer than 2 weeks. Godfrey Dewey did not stay at the center of it much longer. The games ended, the visiting nations went home, and the club his father had built kept opening its doors every winter on the same rules and the same membership rolls it had run on for 3 decades. Within those roles, a change had already started that nobody at the closing ceremony had reason to notice yet. Chapter 6. The Guaranteed Second Use. The ledger that would define the next 5 decades began that same year, quietly, the way declines almost always begin. A shortfall here, a slower renewal season there. Nothing dramatic enough to interrupt the newspaper coverage. From 1932 onward, the Lake Placid Club lost business. Not in one bad season, not in one bad decade. Year after year, for the next 50 years, the ledger ran the wrong direction, and the month the club's name reached its widest audience turned out to be the same month its long decline started. The clock. The reasons arrived slowly enough that no single year could be blamed for them. After the Second World War, commercial air travel put Colorado within a day of Chicago, put Utah within a day of New York, put the Alps within a day of anywhere in America willing to buy a ticket. The chairlift, cheap to install and simple to run, built a new generation of resorts engineered around one activity, skiing, and skiing alone, with none of the club's inherited apparatus of formal dinners, assigned seating, and members who stayed a month rather than a weekend. Lake Placid still had golf courses, dining rooms, and a rule book. It did not yet have the lift infrastructure that Aspen and Sun Valley were building around the sport the club had spent 30 years claiming to invent. The first casualty came at the end of the 1940s. The Stevens House, the grand hotel that had opened on Signal Hill in 1877, that had burned on Christmas Eve of 1885 and been rebuilt within the year, that had held 500 guests at the turn of the century, was torn down and its land sold off as house lots. It was the first of the village's great hotels to go, not to fire, not to bankruptcy, but to a plain calculation. The land was worth more empty than the hotel was worth full. The Lake Placid Club kept opening every season after that on inherited prestige rather than paying guests, an 1895 name carrying an institution that, room by room, had stopped covering its own costs. Then in 1974, the Plateau got another chance at the thing that had made it famous. Lake Placid bid for the 1980 Winter Games and won them with no serious rival. A village of a few thousand people once again handed a global event nobody else that year particularly wanted to host. Washington attached money to the win, $28 million from the federal government to build an Olympic village for the athletes on one condition written into the funding itself. Any Olympic facility built with federal money had to carry a guaranteed secondary use once the games were over. The government had no interest in paying for a building that would sit empty 11 months out of every 12. Robert McEwen, the congressman representing New York's North Country, spent months shopping the building around Washington for a taker. He proposed it as a hospital. Low-income housing was the next pitch. A job training center came after that. Every agency he approached found a reason to decline a permanent commitment on a remote mountain plateau, until only one agency in the government was willing to take the building once the athletes left it, the Bureau of Prisons. So the Olympic Village was designed and built as a federal correctional institution from its first drawings. 937 sleeping rooms went upsized to hold a bed, a sink, and very little else, built to the dimensions of a cell rather than a dormitory. 5 residence buildings were laid out the way prison architects lay out cell blocks, corridors, and sight lines planned for custody rather than comfort. The athletes who would sleep in those rooms in February of 1980 would be living, for 2 weeks, inside a federal prison simply waiting for them to check out. A group calling itself Stop the Olympic Prison sued to block the arrangement, first in 1979 and again in 1980, arguing that no country hosting the world's athletes should house them in a building engineered as a penitentiary. The lawsuits failed both times. The building stood as designed, waiting on the same construction schedule the Bureau of Prisons had already budgeted for it. Within months, 17 nations would open the same games 17 nations had opened here once before, and this time the whole enterprise would nearly come apart before a single medal was awarded. Chapter 7. The Cost of Showing Up. When organizers first pitched the 1980 games to the state and federal sponsors expected to help pay for them, the number they used in the early conversations was roughly $30 million, a figure large enough to sound serious and small enough to sound survivable. It did not survive contact with the construction schedule. Roads had to be widened, an athletes' village had to be built to federal prison specifications. A speed skating oval and 2 ski jumps and a bobsled run had to be brought up to a standard the 1932 games had never approached, and every one of those line items came in over the original estimate. By the time the flame went out, the final bill ran to several times what the bid committee had promised its sponsors, carried almost entirely by the state of New York and the federal government. No village budget could have carried it, no county budget, no fund-a-town of a few thousand people could have raised on its own tax roll in a decade of asking. A village of roughly 2,500 people was hosting an event whose costs no local tax base, however loyal, however well run, could ever have absorbed on its own. The trouble showed within days of the opening ceremony. Organizers had banned private cars from a 15-mile radius around the village and built the entire event on a single untested assumption that a fleet of buses could move roughly 25,000 spectators a day in and out of a plateau connected to the outside world by 2-lane mountain roads. The buses did not run on schedule. Some did not run at all. Thousands of spectators found themselves stranded in Keene, 14 miles from the village, standing in sub-freezing cold with no vehicle, no shelter, and no estimate for when the buses might resume. The 15-mile ban had been designed to keep a plateau with 2-lane roads from choking on its own traffic, and instead it produced the opposite failure, a crowd with no way in and no way home. On one Saturday during the games, more people were stuck outside Lake Placid than lived inside it. a village of 2,500, suddenly responsible for a stranded population it had never agreed to house. The governor of New York declared a limited state of emergency, an order more commonly reserved for blizzards and floods, issued instead for a peacetime sporting event. Inside the village itself, the restaurants, the bars, and the gift shops that had spent 2 years preparing for a flood of customers sat empty, their customers freezing on a highway 14 miles away, unable to reach the businesses that had been built to serve them. On February 22, 1980, in the middle of the same logistical chaos, the United States hockey team played the Soviet Union at the Olympic Center on Main Street and won. The result reordered what these 17 days would be remembered for. Within hours, the transportation failures, the stranded crowds, and the state of emergency were pushed to the margins of the story, displaced by a single afternoon of hockey that would outlive every other fact about the 1980 games. The buses stuck outside Keene, the state of emergency, the empty storefronts, all of it would still have happened whether or not the game had gone the way it went. But almost nobody outside the village would remember any of it in the years that followed. The most famous moment in the history of American amateur sport took place inside a rink standing a few hundred feet from the village post office, in a building the club and the state had built for exactly that contest, and no other reason. From that afternoon forward, Lake Placid's identity as a place was fixed to that single game, the way few towns are ever fixed to a single afternoon of anything. Every hotel that closed after it, every building that came down after it, every failure to keep the crowds that had come once for 17 days would be measured against the height of that one day. The closing ceremony came a few days later. The flags came down, the broadcasters packed their equipment, and the crowds that had once stood frozen on the road to Keene went home in cars that finally moved. 5 weeks after that ceremony, the Lake Placid Club, the institution that had invented the American winter resort season 80 years earlier, would close its doors forever. Chapter 8. The Inventory. On March 30th, 1980, 5 weeks after the closing ceremony, the Lake Placid Club closed for the last time, and the resort hotel that had invented the American winter season filed for bankruptcy. During the games, the club's grounds had served as headquarters for the International Olympic Committee, the address where credentials were issued, and the world's press waited for word. Then the flags came down. And an institution that had kept its doors open through winters no other American resort would attempt could not keep them open through one more spring. Months later, the dormitories built to federal prison specifications reopened as exactly what their blueprints had always described. The Federal Correctional Institution at Ray Brook took its first inmates before the year was out, roughly 1,000 of them, filling rooms that had briefly held Olympic skaters, lugers, and coaching staffs. It stands today as one of the earliest American examples of a prison marketed to a rural county as economic development. A payroll traded for a fence a few miles from Main Street. Lake Placid's most durable inheritance from 1980 is not a metal count. It is a federal prison on Route 86 that the village can neither use nor tear down. The buildings the club left behind had no federal owner to keep them standing. Through the 1980s and into the 1990s, the empty hotel wings above Mirror Lake sat unheated and unwatched, stripped for copper by whoever climbed through a broken window, then set alight by whoever came after, until 1992 alone recorded 8 separate arsons in 11 months. Fire did to the club's wooden wings what bankruptcy had already done to its ledgers. What the arsonists left standing, the county condemned. On the morning of January 1, 2002, a wrecking ball swung into the Agora wing, the last building of the club still on its foundation, and by afternoon 107 years of American resort history, a farmhouse turned membership society turned Olympic host turned bankrupt ruin, had come down in a single day, with nobody in particular watching. What did not come down were the venues themselves, and the reason is ownership, not sentiment. The ski jumps, the bobsled run, and the Olympic Center where the hockey team won its game survived only because New York State owns and operates them through an agency called the Olympic Regional Development Authority, created in 1981 for that purpose. Over roughly the last 6 years, the state has put more than $550 million into these facilities, a renovation program worth $240 million, and a further $104 million into the Olympic Center alone. None of it is self-supporting. These are not businesses. They are public monuments, kept heated and lit by an annual appropriation from a state capital 300 miles south, in the same city this plateau was built to be far from. That ownership model produced its own strategy, and by January of 2023, the strategy was explicit. Lake Placid hosted the FISU World University Games that month, costing roughly $57 million to stage, including $4.6 million paid directly to the International Federation for the right to hold it. Venues built for Olympics that will not return have to be justified in the years between them, so the village now rents itself to whichever sporting body will book it. None of that fixes what the venues cannot. The number of short-term rentals at peak recently ran roughly 40% above where it stood in 2017, high enough that the town imposed a 6-month moratorium trying to slow it. Close to 3 in 10 local employers report that someone they offered a job turned it down for the simple reason that there was nowhere to live. School enrollment keeps falling. The median home in a county built on seasonal hourly work now sells for more than $400,000 in a village of 2,205 people, and shrinking. The plateau that once housed the guides, the cooks, and the boatmen who built the resort increasingly cannot house the people who clean its rooms, groom its trails, and staff its rented events. What remains in the end is an inventory. On the plateau above the village stands the headstone that first drew outsiders here, the grave of a man hanged for a raid and carried home to a farm that had already failed him. Below it sits an empty, grassed-over lot where the Lake Placid Club once stood. There is the oval, still standing, where the miracle happened. There is the prison on the state road, holding its 1,000 inmates a few miles from that same rink. There is the state-owned ski jump, lit against the dark most winter nights, glowing over a village that can no longer house the people who keep it clean.